You believe you think for yourself, not occasionally, but constantly. That your opinions are the result of reasoning, that your conclusions come from logic, that when you feel certain about something, it must be because you've understood it. But certainty is not a sign of understanding. It's a sign of familiarity. And that's where the illusion begins. Because what most people call thinking is not thinking at all. It's recognition. Recognition of patterns they've already absorbed. Recognition of ideas they've already heard. Recognition of beliefs that have been repeated enough times to feel like their own. You don't notice it happening because it doesn't feel like influence. It feels like agreement. It feels like clarity. It feels like something that simply makes sense. But the reason it makes sense is not because it's true. It's because it's familiar. And familiarity has a very specific effect on the brain. The more you see something, the less you question it. The more you hear something, the more natural it feels. The more you repeat something, the more you believe it. Not because you've examined it deeply, but because your brain has stopped resisting it. This is the first layer of the problem. Thinking doesn't disappear all at once. It fades, gradually, quietly, without resistance. At first, you question things, you analyze, you compare, you hesitate. But over time, you begin to rely on shortcuts, because thinking deeply is slow, and your brain is not optimized for slow. It's optimized for efficiency, for speed, for survival. And efficiency requires simplification. It requires patterns. It requires familiarity. So instead of analyzing everything from scratch, your brain looks for what it already knows. If something matches a familiar pattern, it accepts it instantly. If something doesn't, it creates discomfort. And most people don't sit with that discomfort. They resolve it quickly, by rejecting what feels unfamiliar and accepting what feels known. That's how beliefs form, not through deep reasoning, but through repeated exposure. And once a belief is formed, it becomes part of how you interpret everything else. You don't just believe it, you build on it, you defend it, you filter reality through it. And the more you do that, the harder it becomes to question it, because now it's not just an idea, it's part of your identity. And questioning it feels like questioning yourself. That's where thinking truly starts to disappear. Not because people lose intelligence, but because they lose the habit of questioning. They replace it with certainty, and certainty feels powerful. But it's fragile, because it depends entirely on what you've already accepted, not on what is actually true. And once you understand that, you begin to see something uncomfortable. Most people are not forming ideas. They are inheriting them. Not intentionally, not consciously, but continuously. And the more they inherit, the less they examine, until eventually they stop thinking altogether, and they don't even notice.
Now take that individual process and expand it. Imagine not just one person absorbing patterns, but millions. Millions of people exposed to the same ideas, the same narratives, the same emotional triggers, repeated every day across multiple environments. At that point, you no longer have independent thinking. You have alignment. Not forced, not imposed, but naturally formed. Because when enough people are exposed to the same patterns, they begin to think in similar ways. They react in similar ways. They interpret information in similar ways. They arrive at similar conclusions without ever realizing they followed the same path. This is what creates the illusion of collective understanding. It looks like agreement. It looks like shared truth. It looks like clarity. But underneath, it's synchronization. And synchronization is not thinking. It's pattern matching at scale. Now here's what makes this powerful. Once a pattern is strong enough, it sustains itself. People repeat it, defend it, reinforce it, without needing any external pressure. Because it feels right. And anything that feels right doesn't get questioned. That's how systems of belief become stable. Not because they are accurate, but because they are familiar. And familiarity removes friction. Without friction, there is no thinking. There is only continuation. Now look at how this affects behavior. People don't just think in patterns. They act in patterns. They make decisions based on what feels normal. They respond based on what feels expected. They follow paths that others have already taken, not because those paths are correct, but because they are known. And the more a path is repeated, the more it appears safe, even when it isn't. This is where predictability emerges, because when behavior is based on patterns, it becomes consistent. And when it becomes consistent, it becomes predictable. And when it becomes predictable, it becomes influenceable, not through force, but through guidance. Because you don't need to control someone directly if you can shape what feels normal to them. And once something feels normal, they will follow it on their own. That's the system. And you are inside it. Now comes the part most people avoid, not because it's complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. If thinking has been replaced by repetition, then what does it take to bring it back? It doesn't start with new information. It doesn't start with learning more. It starts with interruption, a break in the pattern, a moment where you stop before reacting, a moment where you notice instead of accepting, a moment where something feels right, and instead of agreeing, you ask, why? Why does this feel true? Why does this feel obvious? Why does this feel correct? That question alone changes everything, because it creates distance. Distance between you and your automatic response. Distance between familiarity and acceptance. Distance between influence and belief. And in that distance, thinking becomes possible again. But it's not easy, because real thinking is slow. It doesn't give immediate answers. It doesn't feel satisfying. It creates uncertainty. And most people don't want uncertainty. They want clarity. They want answers. They want to feel right, even if that feeling is built on repetition. So they return to the pattern. They follow. They repeat. They accept. And the cycle continues. But once you've seen it, you can't fully return, because now you're aware of the pattern. You notice how quickly your mind jumps to conclusions. You notice how familiar ideas feel more convincing. You notice how repetition creates certainty. And that awareness changes your relationship with your own thoughts. You stop trusting them blindly. You start examining them. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough to create resistance. Enough to slow down. Enough to not follow automatically. And that's the difference. Not total freedom, not perfect thinking, but interruption. A break in the automatic cycle, a moment where you are not just reacting, but choosing. And most people never reach that point because they never look, they never question, they never pause long enough to see what's actually happening. So they continue, repeating, following, believing, thinking they are thinking when they're not. The biggest illusion isn't control. It's believing you were never influenced in the first place.